Okay, so I'm going to start off, and this presentation is going to talk about how we approach the problem of promoting healthy eating in pubs and clubs. But mainly, Brianna is going to present some of the results, but we're mainly going to focus on how the rapid review process was used to address that issue. I'd like to acknowledge the funders of this project. This was commissioned by the Heart Foundation through Ernst & Young. We've got no conflict of interest or involvement with either of those companies. And as Liam touched on in the last presentation, in the middle of last year, the Heart Foundation released some pretty alarming stats on obesity and overweight in Australia, and you may have seen these in the media. So over a quarter of Australians are obese, a further 35% are overweight. And in response to that, they launched a program called the Healthy Dining Victoria program. They wanted to focus specifically on food choices in pubs and clubs, which was a sector they hadn't targeted before. And by pubs and clubs, I mean your average garden variety pub and club, not the so-called gastropubs, which is a very unfortunate name for a pub, in my personal opinion. Anyway, so as part of that work, they commissioned Behaviour Works to undertake a rapid review. And the review question would be familiar to anyone in this room who's done a literature review or a systematic review. We were aiming to identify and synthesise research evidence to inform strategies to promote healthy dining in Victorian pubs and clubs. The somewhat unique feature was that we did this in 7 days, and I've had a few people criticise me for putting 7 days on because we don't actually want to create the expectation that we can do that. Brianna, we don't want to create a social norm. It would be somewhat ironic, but Brianna and I did pull a few late nights to get this done. We would never ordinarily commission even a rapid review inside a period of 4 to 5 weeks, typically. But this one was in 7 days. It makes a nice slide. Those of you who saw Liam's presentation earlier this morning will know that literature review is part of the BWA method, and obviously this is focusing on that literature review. This quote from an article by Kangura and Grimshaw, who's in the audience today, really sums up very nicely the challenge that we're often faced with in Behaviour Works when we work with our partner organisations. And that challenge will be familiar to many of you, that policymakers and decision makers, and I've highlighted the yellow bits, they want contextualised resources that succinctly and methodically address scientific evidence, but they want it quickly. Much more quickly than what we academics have been used to delivering. I'm an optimist in these matters. 2 years ago, they landed a spaceship on a comet. And so to update the old saying, if you can put a spaceship on a comet, you can put evidence in front of a policymaker or decision maker in a timely manner. It's gone down about as well as I thought. And this challenge has led to what Jeremy and his colleagues in this article a few years ago called the evolution of a rapid review approach. It's not something that's unique to Victoria or Healthy Dining or EY. It's something that's faced all around the world. Decision makers want to have evidence in front of them in a timely manner. And rapid reviews propose to serve 3 important functions. Firstly, an informative brief to prepare stakeholders to actually discuss the issue with some evidence in front of them. So at the debate stage, when you're trying to actually sort out what the problems are. To support the direction and the evidence base for various health or other policy initiatives, bearing in mind that there are other inputs, and that's something that researchers sometimes lose sight of, that evidence is one input, there are many others. And ultimately, that evidence can percolate through to the development of clinical interventions and or health services or other programs. I'm going to run through the main methodological differences between a rapid evidence review and what traditional systematic review looks like. Has everyone heard of traditional systematic literature reviews? Hands up if you haven't. So thanks, Liam. So a traditional academic systematic literature review is usually undertaken in 6 months to 2 years. It involves a very in-depth examination of primary literature around a specific review question, where you evaluate the quality of that literature. And the Cochrane is the premier source of health systematic literature reviews, and they have a very large database of those reviews. And there are many similarities from an academic perspective. We do specify the question in advance. We don't kind of look at the databases and make it up as we go along. But we have a generally broader approach to the question in rapid evidence reviews because we want to generate some key themes and messages from the literature. Like a traditional systematic review, we use an explicit and comprehensive search strategy. In other words, we tell you exactly where we got the evidence from, which databases. We often apply limits to limit the amount of volume that we get. So we might, for example, focus on research from the last 3 to 5 years. But we do have criteria for what's going to be in and out of the review. The other important distinction is that the unit of analysis in a rapid evidence review is actually reviews themselves. In other words, we're trying to render an overview of related systematic reviews to that topic. We're not looking at primary studies, which is what traditional systematic reviews do. Like a traditional systematic review, we do appraise the quality of those studies, and Brianna's going to highlight the importance of that when she takes over in a moment. And we try to bring the messages together in a descriptive or thematic way so that you can highlight what are the key findings in that body of literature. Obviously, in a traditional systematic review, that is done in a lot more depth, and there are some other sophisticated statistical techniques that you can use to pull studies together and tell a story about multiple randomised controlled trials. That's not available in a rapid review context. And I think it's really important to emphasise the inferences that you can make at the end of that. And this is a trade-off. We're delivering something in weeks or days, in this case, that a traditional systematic review can take months or years to deliver, and that does come at a cost. So just to reiterate, I think the two key differences around the rapid review process are the time frame and the unit of analysis being reviews. If reviews aren't available, you can look at primary studies of a certain calibre or size, but they're best done when there's existing review evidence. We apply and we explicitly put these two disclaimers in all of our rapid reviews at BWA, and I think they're really important. The first is that you need to interpret the review in the context that it is a rapid review, and that if you did do that more comprehensive interrogation literature, you might get different conclusions, you might get different insights, and that might actually change the way you think. And the second really important point to make, especially with people like Jeremy from the Cochrane collaboration in the room, is that we don't propose rapid reviews as an alternative to systematic reviews. And in fact, this exact wording is what we put in all of our sort of expressions of interest documents, that we recommend systematic reviews be undertaken wherever possible. And actually, one of the insights I've gained from being with Jeremy this week with the partners is that it's not necessarily one or the other. It might be that if you have an issue that you know is going to be on the agenda for a number of years, sure, do a rapid review to mobilise some evidence quickly, but why not also consider doing that systematic review piece that will always be there when that issue comes up again and again and again in the policy cycle. I'm going to hand over to Brianna now, who's going to take you through some of the other methodological features and touch on the results of the review.
Thanks, Peter. It's always a little bit exciting for me when I can actually see over the podium. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to walk us through how we actually conducted the rapid review. So first, similar to a systematic review, we start out by searching the literature, and we end up with some junk which we get rid of. We then end up with a whole bunch of small studies, a few less larger studies, and what we're really interested in is the systematic reviews. And so the important part here, which Peter touched on, is that we are interested in systematic reviews, and if they're not available, you can refer to the larger primary studies, but what that might indicate is that a systematic review on that topic is needed. We ended up with 9 systematic reviews, which we were pretty happy with. So the next thing we do is extract all the information that we need from the systematic reviews. And this is similar to the process that would be conducted in a systematic review. It includes the same kind of integrity, double extraction, all that stuff. The main difference is the second last dot point there, which is around the author's conclusions. Because in a rapid review, we're not reanalyzing any data. We're not doing a meta-analysis where we combine all the primary data and see what it tells us. We are relying on the author's conclusions and what they've found in their own systematic review, which means that the last point there around quality assessment is really important, because we want to have some reliability that what the authors of the systematic reviews have found is reliable and that we can have confidence in what conclusions we're drawing in our rapid review. And I would like to just go through a quick example about why quality assessment is so important. So this graph shows not two types of studies. They're all case control studies where you have one person in a particular condition and you pair them with somebody very similar but who doesn't have that condition or there's something different. And we have two types of case control studies. One that has blinding, where neither the participants nor the experimenter was aware of which group the participant belonged to. And the studies that don't have blinding, somebody knew which group the participant was in. Now, as you can see, there's a pretty big difference between what these two types of studies find. For the ones without blinding, we have a very significant odds ratio, and it's very significant. For the ones that did have blinding, all of a sudden that odds ratio is much lower, and importantly, it's no longer significant. And the reason this is so important is that we would draw very different conclusions from this data if we weren't considering the quality. And so quality assessment is a key part of what we do in a rapid review process. It allows us the confidence to say that the conclusions we're drawing and the possible recommendations that might come with that are reliable. So what did we find? We identified 3 different types of interventions. The first was around social norms and social modelling. So as Liam kind of spoke about before, what are the people around you doing? What do they think about eating more? Are they eating more? The second type was around the manipulation of portion, dishware and cutlery size. So if we give people smaller plates, will they eat less? And lastly, we had the provision of health information. So I'm sure you've all seen examples of menus that now have kind of calorie information. You may have even noticed during lunch that there were a couple of signs on the table with calorie information. Sorry. My voice sometimes gets a little bit dry, and for some reason this often happens when I'm publicly speak. Just a coincidence, I'm sure. Anyway, so the strongest evidence we found was for the provision of health information. We found 3 systematic reviews. The quality was moderately high to high for all of them. So we were fairly confident in the evidence that we could draw from those systematic reviews. The really important thing we found here was that the provision of health information was significant, but only when you paired it with some kind of interpretive information, something that allowed people to make sense of it. So not just 600 calories, but I have to run for 7 Ks to work that off. Next, we found the social norms and social modelling. It was still effective, but less so. The 3 systematic reviews we found were kind of fair to moderately high quality, and they all found an effect that social norms did affect how much food people were consuming, but it did so proportionally to their quality. So the highest quality study found the lowest effect. And lastly, for the manipulation of portion, dishware, cutlery size, 4 systematic reviews, variable quality from kind of fair to moderately high, and essentially the results were inconclusive. We couldn't really say one way or the other, given the quality of the evidence, if it worked or not. So what do we do with this information? And there are a couple of things that we can take away. Firstly, around the target audience. So who are we interested? Who do we want to target with our potential interventions? And one of the really key findings that came out of the review was around the social norms. One study actually found that it was less effective in overweight and obese populations. And so if that's who you're targeting, that intervention is actually going to be less effective. And so when we're gathering evidence, it's important to bear in mind, well, who are we wanting to target? Is it just the general population, or are we interested in some subgroups that we should maybe try to pull out of the evidence? Similarly, there are very different behaviours between children and adults, and so if you're trying to target one over the other, you may want to pay attention to the evidence that shows, okay, well, actually children's decision-making in dining out settings is often, influenced by their parents, so how much control they have is arguable. Next is around the setting. So initially in our inclusion criteria, we wanted to include only systematic reviews that had looked at naturalistic dining settings, so in pubs and clubs. However, when we when we actually looked at the literature, we couldn't discriminate the systematic reviews on that level. And so we had to broaden our criteria so that we were also including experimental settings kind of done in universities and manipulated environments. Which kind of leads us to, well, how well would that translate into the real world where there are potentially multiple interventions, there's the whole environment of the restaurant that's going to influence people, the colour of the walls, the music, the menu, the noise, all these things actually also contribute to what and how people are eating. Which brings me to a couple of real-life examples about what happens when you actually try to implement some of these interventions. Now, some of you may have heard of Michael Bloomberg, was the mayor of New York, and he tried to introduce a cap on soda bottles. So over a particular size, he wanted to say, no, a number of retailers can't sell those anymore. Met with substantial resistance, both from the general population and from industry, and it was actually eventually thrown out by the magistrates' court, saying it was beyond his regulatory authority. So even when we have good intentions, there's also a whole range of other issues that might be needed to take into consideration if we want to implement them. Similarly, I mentioned before, some of you may have seen calorie information on menus, but if there's no way to help people interpret that, it might not actually be doing anything. And so I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to quickly talk about what impact our review had. And we have a couple of direct quotes from somebody at the Heart Foundation, Ronnie, about what they were able to learn from the rapid review and what they could take away from it. So it reinforced to government that a combination of interventions are likely to provide the best outcome, provided a counterpoint to the long-held conventional wisdom around the effectiveness of crockery and cutlery size. We have used this challenge of conventional wisdom in subsequent campaign bids, and the evidence provided around new social norms is one of the interventions we would be able to try. And so it's clear that they were actually able to use the evidence that we provided to them, and it changed the course that they were taking with respect to this issue. And so I'm going to quickly summarise what the key messages to take away from this presentation are. The first is if you're time limited. So as Peter mentioned, systematic reviews can take at least 6 months, normally about 2 years. So if you've only got a couple of months to gather evidence, a rapid review may be applicable. Review evidence is available or some summary evidence. So if there are no systematic reviews, if industry hasn't summarised literature in any way, a rapid review might be quite difficult. Important to refine questions with stakeholders. So there may need to be a little bit of negotiation around, okay, well, what are the exact parameters of what we're asking? We had to loosen our criteria around the setting because that level of evidence just wasn't available. And interested in the key findings. So as Peter mentioned, it's really about the big messages of an area. It's not necessarily going to provide the nuance and the detail that a systematic review or primary studies do, but it will provide the big messages. And lastly, no directional hypotheses. So it's important to remain open to what the evidence is going to tell you. And if you're just looking for evidence around, well, we've decided we want to do this and we want to know what evidence supports that, rapid reviews will often kind of overturn things that might not necessarily align with where you'd envisage going. And that's it.